Hi, this is Andrew Park. I frequently get asked about the issue of terminology, how to use the term LGBT or other variations of it in papers, proposals, and presentations. In this description to this video, I'm going to put a link to a written version of this presentation, as well as some resources on how to use the terms intersex and transgender properly. Now, there's no agreement on the use of the term LGBT, so these are my guidelines, and many people may have different practices. But I think the first thing that you need to do is ask three questions. First is, what level of precision are you seeking to achieve? Do you need to refer to exactly a particular set of people, or is it a more general reference to an indefinite group of people? Second, self-identity. Are these people who have self-identified as LGBT or T, or are you classifying them as LGBT through some other means like their sexual or gender history? And third, audience understanding. Does it matter to you that the audience immediately understands the terms that you use, or is it okay for you to spend the effort to educate them about new terms? So I want to look at what LGBT is and what it means, the precision issue, the issue of identity, the footnote fix, which is a very common approach to this, and other terms such as sexual and gender minorities and SOGI. So LGBT is an abbreviation for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, but it's an abbreviation by use of alphabetism. And here's an example of what I mean by that. I used to be an officer in the American Federation of Government Employees. That can be abbreviated as an alphabetism, where you say each letter, AFGE, or it can be abbreviated as an acronym, where you pronounce it like a word, AFGE. Now, you can't pronounce LGBT like a word, so we're kind of stuck with alphabetism, although I've got to say there have been valiant attempts to try to make it into a word. Some of my favorites are lesbigator, quilt bag, and biglet. But no one really uses those, so this is just to make the point that we're stuck with an alphabetism. So LGBT can mean generally two types of things. One is it's used as an umbrella term to refer to all those people whose gender and sexuality does not conform to the expected norms of their culture and society. So using it as an umbrella term, it means LGBT may include people who do not identify as LGBT, but identify as some other form, maybe an indigenous sexuality like Hijra in India or Fa'afafine in the Pacific. The second meaning of LGBT is more specific. LGBT is a literal abbreviation for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, and it means those four groups of people. And if you want to include other groups, then you've got to add letters and terms: questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit. This is from the International Lesbian Gay Association, a statement about indigenous peoples. As part of our identities, we might not identify as LGBTQI persons, but LGBTQI people do exist in our communities. We just self-identify with another expression. So here, ILGA is using LGBTQI to refer to people who do not identify as LGBTQI. So they're using it as an umbrella term to cover different identities. If you were to use LGBTQI in a specific sense, you would say, well, it doesn't include, for instance, asexuals. You have to add the A, or you would want to list them as well. So let's look at the issue of precision. LGBT is often used where you don't need to be that precise. You're referring to an indefinite group of people. So we support the rights of our LGBT workers. We're happy to include the members of the LGBT community. There, you're referring to it in the broad sense. LGBT can also be used to describe an organization or an issue. Human Rights Campaign is an LGBT organization. Workplace fairness is an LGBT issue. Now, if you care about whether your audience understands right away, you should try to figure out what form of LGBT is used in the relevant sector. For instance, I commonly use LGBTI or LGBTQI because those are commonly used in the international sector. In Canada, it's commonly, what the form is LGBTQ and then the number 2, which refers to Indigenous populations in Canada. LGBTQ seems to be used in the general political discussions here in the US. And in educational settings, you probably, like universities or colleges, you probably want to use all possible identities that you might be including. So when you do need to be precise, or when you know about the gender and sexualities of the people to whom you're referring, don't use LGBT unless it really describes them. So before I go on, let me say this. If you feel that you need to use the term LGBT to be just generally inclusive, think about that first. It's better to be authentic and accurate and just use LGB if you're referring to sexual orientation. It's better to be accurate than to be inclusive in an insincere way. So don't use LGBT just because you think, oh, we have to. And here's some examples. When referring to a particular person, saying LGBT is inappropriate because you cannot be lesbian and gay at the same time. It doesn't make sense. Just say the speaker is a gay man or a trans woman. When referring to one gender, it's also inappropriate. Our program serves men, including LGBT men. Well, it doesn't make sense to have lesbian men. Say GB men or GBT men. And also, this is more an issue of methodology than terminology, but be careful if you're going to use the term LGBT as a set of categories to divide people up into. So we divided people up into 4 groups, L, G, B, and T. The problem with this is, if somebody is categorized as trans, does that mean they no longer have a sexual orientation? Well, that's wrong. A trans person can be L or G or B. The other problem is that trans groups all genders together and LGB splits genders out. So there are some problems with categorization according to that schema. Now, with regard to identity, remember, with regard to sexual or gender identity, a person's identity is whatever they say they are. It's completely self-determined. If a man is having sex with other men and he identifies himself as straight, then his identity is heterosexual. But sexual orientation can be measured by 3 different things: identity, behavior, or desire. So the rule is this: where relevant, consider clarifying whether you are labeling somebody as LGBT based on their self-declared identity or based on some other characteristic like their sexual history, their gender history, etc. Gender identity, sometimes transgender people do not identify as transgender. Their identity is male or female because that's what they've chosen. Nevertheless, you may choose to classify them as transgender because they are male now and they were assigned female at birth. Nevertheless, if they identify as male, that is their identity. Indigenous people also may have different identities, and the same identity may be their sexual orientation and their gender identity, like Hijra in India or Metis in the Himalaya. Intersex is a little bit different. Being intersex depends on having a trait of intersex characteristics. We all have sex characteristics, genitalia, hormones, chromosomes. An intersex person has sex characteristics that don't all align with the expectations of male or female. So, similar to having high IQ or to being HIV positive, this is not initially an identity, but you can make it one. If you have high IQ, you can join Mensa, put it on your resume. If you're HIV positive, you can publicly disclose it and make it part of your identity. Same thing with intersex. But primarily, it is a trait, not an identity. Now, one example where you'd want to figure out whether you're talking about self-identity or other characteristics is this sentence. Sexually transmitted infections are a particular concern for LGB people. So having sex is very relevant to having a sexually transmitted infection. So one might expect that you are saying people are gay or lesbian or bisexual because of their sexual history rather than their identity. So in this instance, you might want to do what I call the footnote fix. And this is used in many, many documents that use the term LGBT. The first time something is introduced, you drop a footnote, and here's one possible one, depending on what you really mean by LGB. The term LGB refers to individuals who self-identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Another one is dropping a footnote saying that the term LGB refers to people who have engaged in sexual activity with a member of the same gender or sex. A much broader version of this might be LGB refers to individuals whose sexual orientation does not conform to cultural expectations of sexuality in their relevant gender, culture, or society. So that brings us to the term sexual and gender minority, because this is where you look at this from a perspective of a statistical minority being different than the statistical majority. And this term is often used in social sciences because it fits very well with models of demography, epidemiology, and quantitative research. It usually refers to people whose sexuality and gender, from any perspective, identity, behavior, history, desire, differs from that of the majority. So it's a very broad term. The other term is SOGI. That was used 10 years ago. Now, increasingly, we're using the term SOGI-esque, which stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, and sex characteristics. This is a term that's often been used in the human rights arena because human rights are framed as rights that everybody has. So everybody deserves equality regardless of their SOGI-esque. And everybody has a SOGI-esque. Everybody has a sexual orientation. Everybody has a gender identity, and so on. So this does not refer to a group of people. This refers to everybody, but you might refer to those people that are stigmatized because of their SOGI-esque. Or you might refer to organizations that do work related to SOGI-esque and use SOGI-esque as a modifier in that way. I hope this has helped, and I'll leave the comments open so we can have more discussion about how to address these issues. Thank you very much.